Well, the human cost of counterterrorism practices used by the United States government has skyrocketed since September 11th, 2001. According to a new report from Human Rights Watch, it details the extent of allegedly improper profiling, extensive sting operations, and the conditions of confinement. Since September 11th, more than 2001, that is, more than 500 individuals have been prosecuted in U.S. federal courts for terrorism or related offenses, which is about 40 cases per year on average. Now, nearly half of those convictions resulted from informant-based cases, and almost 30% of those cases were sting operations in which the informant played an active role in the underlying so-called plot. On top of this, new information has emerged regarding terrorist watch lists in general. According to the Associated Press, around 99% of the names submitted are accepted, which has led to more than 1.5 million names being added in the last 5 years alone. The State Department has responded to the Human Rights Watch report by saying the report itself acknowledges that many of the decisions that the report criticizes are not only lawful, but also specifically approved by federal judges, just as the material support statute that the report criticizes was upheld as constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, to explain the Human Rights Watch report, I was joined earlier by Andrea Prasso, the Deputy Washington Director for Human Rights Watch. I first asked her to give me some examples of how the U.S. might be creating terrorists out of innocent people.
We documented cases where the FBI will send an informant to, say, a mosque parking lot, and encourage that informant to strike up conversations with people about subjects like jihad, eventually to find people who maybe are interested in a conversation. And the informant might spend weeks or months developing a relationship with these people, discussing the idea of violent jihad, discussing the idea of terrorist attacks, sometimes showing people inflammatory photos of violence perpetrated by Americans and encouraging them to plan terrorist attacks. And then the FBI, of course, provides the means to commit the attacks. Frequently, they provide inert weapons. They have provided money to allow people to travel to locations to plan a terrorist attack. So in some cases, we've documented the FBI essentially manufacturing the entire plot.
Well, how does a defendant in one of these cases make a claim of entrapment? Because he's got to show that the government induced him to commit the crime, that he wasn't predisposed to commit it. But given some of these people's background, it's very hard for them to make that case, is it not?
Right. So in a terrorism case, when you are looking at whether the defendant was predisposed to commit terrorism, what the government does is they introduce all sorts of evidence about what was on the defendant's computer. So if someone has gone to websites that have particularly violent images or discuss a violent ideology, if that's on the defendant's computer, that's evidence that the prosecutors will introduce. We also documented the use of types of expert testimony, where experts talk about terrorism in a much broader context. So people in the U.S. are frequently charged with crimes like conspiracy or attempting to provide material support to terrorists. The prosecution then can admit evidence totally unrelated to the defendant, but about terrorism in general. And that inflames the jury. The jury is scared of terrorism. So all these issues sort of bundle together, making it very difficult for a defendant to show that he was entrapped.
Well, this report also finds that, speaking of these targets, American Muslims are unfairly targeted in FBI and Department of Justice counterterrorism operations. How so? Sort of, shine a light on the way this is actually done.
We've talked about the idea of the FBI and law enforcement in general treating American Muslims as terrorists in waiting. There is this theory the FBI has used, the so-called radicalization theory, that suggests that people who, say, go to websites that talk about violent jihad or participate in discussion forums or maybe even talk about it themselves on the street or in their community centers, the idea is that those people have a greater propensity towards violence. But there isn't actually any evidence that that's true. And what we've seen is law enforcement targeting people at times based on ideas and thoughts and speech that should be protected by freedom of expression laws.
What policy changes and reforms does Human Rights Watch recommend for the Department of Justice to rein in these potential abuses during their terrorism investigations?
Well, the first thing is we think the use of informants needs to be curtailed and subject to robust oversight. The case of the Newburgh Four, for example, is a very prominent one. The informant offered the defendants $250,000. And these are defendants who were poor. In one case, one of them had a very sick brother who needed medical treatment. the offer of $250,000 was very tempting. Now, there's testimony in that case that the FBI didn't know the informant offered that much money. They hadn't authorized it. Of course, the person was still acting as an agent of the government, but that's a great example of why the FBI needs to conduct more robust oversight over their own informants and why Congress needs to conduct robust oversight over the FBI and the Justice Department.
How many resources does the FBI and the Department of Justice put towards the investigation of terrorism?
Since 9/11, the FBI has actually diverted significant resources to counterterrorism, diverted away from investigation of white-collar crimes in particular, but also non-terrorism, violent and non-violent crimes. And in fact, there's an Inspector General report from the FBI documenting this shift, that certain FBI field offices feel they have fewer resources to pursue other non-terrorism related offenses. And then you look at some of the cases that we documented in this report where the person likely would never have tried to commit a criminal act but for the involvement of law enforcement, and think about how much better those resources could be used to actually pursue the real criminals.
That was Andrea Prasso, the Deputy Washington Director of Human Rights Watch.